You know, history is packed with these bizarre turning points, but this one is really something else. We're talking about a total, complete failure. A botched coup, a chaotic mess in the streets that honestly should have been the end of a political career. But somehow, it became the exact opposite. It became a launchpad. This is the story of the beer hall putsch, and how a spectacular failure was twisted into a strategic masterpiece.
So yeah, that's the big question we're going to tackle, right? How on earth did a failed coup end up becoming a political triumph? It's a total paradox, and it tells us so much about power, propaganda, and, well, politics. How does a humiliating public faceplant become one of the most powerful founding myths for the Nazi Party? Let's get into it.
Okay, so to really understand what was going through their heads, we've got to look south, to Italy. See, back in the early 1920s, a pretty unknown guy named Adolf Hitler was paying very close attention to what was happening on the world stage. He was looking for a playbook, a blueprint for how to seize power.
And, well, he found his model in Benito Mussolini. Just look at this. In 1922, Mussolini's March on Rome was a wild success. The Italian government basically got scared, thought a civil war was coming, and just handed him the keys. They made him prime minister. For Hitler, watching this from Germany, it was like a lightning bolt. The lesson seemed so simple. You don't ask for power. You take it. And just like that, the plan was born. We're going to do our own March on Rome, but it's going to be a march on Berlin.
And that brings us right to the night of the putsch. The plan was pretty straightforward, at least on paper. First, you take over the government of Bavaria, right there in Munich. Then, you use that as your base of operations, your launch pad, to march on the capital, Berlin. And the place where this whole thing was supposed to kick off? A huge, packed-to-the-rafters beer hall.
Yep, the Burgerbräukeller. On the evening of November 8, 1923, this place was absolutely jamming. We're talking the who's who of Bavarian politics, all the big military brass, they're all there. Even the state commissioner, a guy named Gustav Kahr, is right in the middle of giving a speech. For Hitler, this was just perfect. It was a golden opportunity to trap the entire state leadership in one room all at once.
And to make absolutely sure no one was going anywhere, he surrounded the building. He had about 600 of his armed SA stormtroopers, his own private army, basically. They had the place completely locked down. So the vibe inside? Yeah, it was about to go from a boring political speech to a full-blown hostile takeover.
Then, all of a sudden, Hitler storms in, pulls out a pistol, fires a shot right into the ceiling. You can bet that got everyone's attention. And he shouts, "The national revolution has begun." I mean, this was pure political theater. It was all about shock, awe, and grabbing control of the narrative from the very first second.
So next, he shoves the top Bavarian leaders into a side room. Literally, at gunpoint, he tells them, okay, there's a new government in Germany, and I'm in charge. Now, to add some weight to this, the famous World War I general, Ludendorff, shows up and sides with Hitler, which was a huge surprise. So the leaders, with a gun in their face, they kind of mumble their agreement. But here's the thing about support you get at gunpoint. It's not exactly reliable, is it? And right there, the whole plan was already starting to fall apart.
So what happens next? Well, that victory he seemed to have won inside the beer hall, it basically melted away overnight. By the time the sun came up the next morning, this grand revolution had collapsed into a total mess, a chaotic and ultimately deadly march through the streets.
I mean, just look at this timeline. It shows you exactly how fast everything unraveled. During the night, those leaders he'd held at gunpoint, they slip away and immediately start calling in the police and army units that were still loyal to the government. So by morning, Hitler's only move left is this desperate gamble. Lead a march through the city and hope the public joins in. But they march right into a police cordon, and within minutes, the whole thing turns violent.
The result was a short, nasty firefight. The numbers speak for themselves. 16 Nazis and 4 policemen were killed. This was not some glorious revolution. It was a street fight, plain and simple. And the Nazis lost. Badly. From a military perspective, the putsch was an absolute catastrophic failure.
And what about the man who started it all? In the middle of the chaos, Hitler gets pulled down, dislocates his shoulder, and then just flees, jumps into a getaway car, and takes off. It was not a good look, and his enemies would use that image of him running away to mock him for years. 2 days later, they find him hiding in the attic of a friend's house and arrest him. I mean, by any normal measure, this should have been it. Game over, end of story.
But it wasn't the end.
Not even close. In fact, this is the exact moment where the story takes a wild turn. This is where the colossal failure starts to morph into a huge strategic win. The trial that was supposed to put him away as a traitor, it ended up turning him into a national star.
And make no mistake, the charge was high treason. I mean, that's about as serious as it gets. This trial, which took place in early 1924, was designed to be the final nail in his political coffin, period.
Just look at this transformation. It's stunning. So how did this happen? Well, he got a courtroom full of sympathetic, right-wing judges who basically just let him talk and talk for hours. The national press was there covering every single word. So he took the stand and turned it into his own personal political rally. He completely flipped the narrative. He argued that he wasn't the traitor. No, the real traitors were the politicians who signed the humiliating Treaty of Versailles. He went into that trial a failed local rabble-rouser and came out looking like a patriotic defender of Germany.
So, he was found guilty. But getting convicted didn't send him into obscurity. Not at all. Instead, it led to this strange period of reflection, and most importantly, a total strategic rethink, all from inside a surprisingly comfortable prison. This is where the real lesson of the whole failed putsch was finally learned.
So, you'd think the sentence for high treason would be pretty harsh, right? He got 5 years. But get this, he only ended up serving 9 months. 9! And it was in a minimum security prison. The sentence was so incredibly light, it was almost a joke. It just showed how much quiet support he actually had inside the system.
Yeah, his time in Landsberg prison wasn't exactly hard time. It was more like a political retreat with good room service. He basically held court, with a non-stop parade of visitors coming to see him. He got gifts, and, crucially, this is where he dictated the first volume of his book, Mein Kampf, to his pal Rudolf Hess. He was treated less like a prisoner and more like a visiting celebrity.
And this right here, this is the single most important thing that came out of this whole disaster. While in prison, Hitler had his big epiphany. He realized that trying to take over by force just wasn't going to work. The state was too strong. So a new strategy was born. The path to power had to be legal. He decided he would use the democratic system against itself. Use elections, use free speech, use the right to assemble, all to win power and then, once he had it, to destroy democracy from the inside. It was a much slower, more patient, and frankly, a much more dangerous idea.
And that leaves us with a really chilling final thought, doesn't it? The beer hall putsch was an absolute, undeniable failure. But it was that exact failure that taught Hitler the winning strategy. It pushed him off the path of violent revolution and onto the so-called legal path that, just 10 years later, would give him total control of Germany. So it makes you wonder, what if the putsch had actually succeeded back in 1923? It's a strange paradox, but by feeling so badly, Hitler may have actually found a surer, more effective way to achieve his goals.
All right, let's get right into it. This is one of those questions in history that it's mind-boggling, right? How on earth does a tiny, basically irrelevant political party, a group that pretty much everyone laughed at, end up taking complete control of one of the most advanced, most educated countries in Europe? It's an absolutely unbelievable story. And that's really the core question we're going to unpack here. How did the Nazis go from a political joke to the absolute masters of Germany in what feels like the blink of an eye? It's a crazy story, and it all starts with a single, tiny number, 2.6%. Just let that sink in for a second. In the 1928 election in Germany, that's all the Nazis got. I mean, to put that in perspective, that's not just losing an election, that is complete and utter political irrelevance. They were nothing. Just a tiny bunch of extremists that absolutely no one was taking seriously. Okay, so to really get how they made that insane leap, we've got to rewind a bit, back to the mid-1920s. See, at this point, Germany was actually doing okay. The economy was starting to stabilize, mostly thanks to some big American loans. The crazy hyperinflation was finally getting under control. And, when things are generally getting better, people aren't really interested in radical, extreme politics. But here's what's so fascinating. While his party is getting absolutely crushed in the elections, what's Hitler doing? He's not just sitting around. Oh no, he's busy. He's rebuilding the entire party structure from the ground up. He's publishing the second part of his book, Mein Kampf. And this is key, he's ruthlessly getting rid of anyone inside the party who might challenge him. He's basically building this perfectly oiled machine, just waiting for his chance. And then, in 1929, his chance arrived. And it was a catastrophe. The Wall Street crash wasn't just some problem for America. It was like pulling a pin on a global economic grenade, and it was about to absolutely shatter German society and change its politics forever. October 24th, 1929. This is the day the world changed. All those American loans that had been holding up Germany's fragile recovery, poof, they were gone. The banks called them in, and Germany's entire economy just started to crumble. We're talking practically overnight. And the human cost, it was just staggering. By 1932, you have 6 million Germans unemployed. That's not just some number on a page. That's a nationwide disaster. It means hunger. It means people losing their homes. It's just pure crippling despair on a massive scale. I mean, think about that. Almost a third of the entire country's workforce, jobless. Factories were ghost towns. Banks were locking their doors for good. Hope was just gone. And when hope disappears, so does your faith in the system. People looked at their democratic government and saw leaders who were totally powerless to stop the bleeding. And here's where you can really see the political system just breaking down. The government was so fractured it couldn't get anything done. So they started using this, let's call it a constitutional loophole, Article 48. It basically let the president rule by himself, without parliament. I mean, democracy was failing right there in front of everyone's eyes. And when that happens, people get desperate. They start looking for a strong leader, someone who promises simple answers and drastic action. So you have this perfect storm, right? Economic chaos, plus a government that can't govern. It's a recipe for disaster. The middle ground in politics just completely vanished. And voters started running, not walking, running to the extreme fringes. You had the communists on one side and Hitler's Nazis on the other. And just look at this jump. It's insane. In the 1930 election, the Nazis rocket from just 12 seats in parliament to 107. They go from that pathetic 2.6% to over 18% of the vote in 2 years. 2! They went from being a total joke to the second biggest party in the entire country. Nobody could believe it. And it didn't stop there. The momentum just kept building. By July 1932, their support doubles again, hitting a peak of over 37%. At that point, they weren't just a big party. They were, by a long shot, the biggest party in Germany. Hitler was no longer some fringe lunatic. He was a political force you simply could not ignore. Okay, but here's a really important thing to understand. Just because you have the most votes doesn't mean you automatically get to be in charge. Not yet. Getting the top job, becoming chancellor, that was going to require a very, very dangerous political game. And Hitler, he played this brilliantly and terrifyingly. He had two faces. On one hand, you had Hitler, the statesman. He'd put on a suit, meet with powerful industrialists and generals, and tell them, don't worry, I'm the only one who can stop the communists. But at the exact same time, you had Hitler, the thug. He'd unleash his private army, the brown shirts, to cause absolute chaos, beating up his political rivals in the streets. Now, the old establishment, guys like the 84-year-old President Hindenburg, they couldn't stand him. They just hated him. Hindenburg looked at Hitler and saw this vulgar little guy from the lower classes. He called him that bohemian corporal. I mean, total contempt. And even after the Nazis won that huge election in July 32, Hindenburg just said, no way, I am not making that guy chancellor. It was a fatal, fatal underestimation. And then something fascinating happens. A few months later, there's another election. And this time, the Nazi vote actually goes down. The party's running out of cash, the momentum seems to be fading, and for just a second you think, maybe he blew it. Maybe this is as far as he gets. It really looked like his moment had passed. But this moment of weakness is exactly when Germany's old-school conservative leaders made, well, what might be the single biggest political blunder in modern history. They were terrified of a communist takeover, and they were desperate to stay in power. So they came up with a plan. And here's how their disastrous logic went. They'd go to President Hindenburg and say, look, you have to make Hitler the chancellor. But, and this was their big idea, they would surround him with their own guys in all the important cabinet jobs. The plan was to use his popularity, let him be the face of the government, while they secretly pulled all the strings. They honestly thought they could control him, that they could put a leash on this tiger. And on January 30th, 1933, their plan went into action. The old president, Hindenburg, finally gave in. He swore in Adolf Hitler as the Chancellor of Germany. And all those clever conservative politicians, they thought they'd won. They thought they had him right where they wanted him, trapped in their little box. They had no idea how wrong they were. And just like that, the unbelievable became the inevitable. You see, this story, it isn't just about Germany in the 1930s. It's not just about one man or one party. It's a chilling lesson for any time, for any country. And it leaves us with this huge, critical question that we always have to keep in mind. When democratic systems start to fail, when people completely lose hope, what or who is waiting in the wings to fill that vacuum?
So, how does a democracy actually die? We tend to think of it as this long, slow process, right? A gradual decay. But what happened in Germany in the 1930s? Well, it was anything but slow. It was shockingly fast. This is the story of how one man grabbed absolute power in just 18 months.
Okay, so when Adolf Hitler first became Chancellor of Germany, you'd think the political old guard would be terrified, right? But they weren't. Not at all. In fact, they were pretty smug about it. They thought, hey, this guy's a radical, sure, but we can control him. He's our puppet.
And that was maybe one of the single biggest miscalculations in all of modern history. They thought they'd built a cage to contain him. Turns out, that cage was about to expand and imprison an entire country. Just look at this timeline. January 1933 to August 1934. That's it. 18 months. I mean, think about that. That's all it took to go from being a chancellor who was supposedly on a leash to the absolute, undisputed Führer of Germany. So the big question is, how on earth did it happen so incredibly fast?
Well, it all starts with this massive underestimation. His own political allies, the ones who put him in power, thought they held all the cards. They thought they were the smart ones in the room.
And you can kind of see why they thought that, right? I mean, look at his very first cabinet. The Nazis only held 3 out of 12 spots. So guys like the Vice Chancellor, von Papen, they're looking at this math and thinking, perfect, we've got them surrounded, we're the ones really pulling the strings. It was a total illusion of control.
But that illusion, it was about to be completely shattered. All it took was one single, incredibly dramatic event. An event that gave Hitler the perfect excuse to start tearing down German democracy one piece at a time.
So get this, less than a month after he takes office, the Reichstag building, the German parliament, is on fire. They find a Dutch communist at the scene, and he even confesses. But the question has always been, was he really acting alone? Or was this a setup, a Nazi conspiracy? It's a debate that historians are still having today.
But you know what? For Hitler, the answer to that question didn't even matter. Who actually started the fire was totally beside the point. What mattered was the opportunity it created, and he saw that opportunity instantly and moved to exploit it with, frankly, terrifying speed.
Literally the very next day, he goes to President Hindenburg and convinces him to sign this thing, what we now call the Reichstag Fire Decree. And let's be clear, this wasn't just some new law. It was basically a constitutional kill switch. Of course, it was sold as a temporary emergency measure to protect Germany from a so-called communist uprising.
And just like that, overnight, the most basic rights of a free society just vanished. Your freedom of speech, gone. The right to assemble, gone. Freedom of the press, your right to privacy, all of it wiped out with a single signature. And the scariest part? That temporary decree, it was never, ever repealed. Okay, so with his political opponents now being rounded up and basic rights just gone, Hitler moves on to the next part of his plan. And this part is just genius in a really twisted way. He's going to use the machinery of democracy to make democracy kill itself.
First thing he does is call for new elections. And you'd think, with all the intimidation and with total control of the media, he'd win in a landslide, right? Well, he didn't. The Nazis still didn't get an outright majority. They came in just under 44%. So that told him, okay, I can't just rule with the existing system. I have to completely change the rules of the game.
So he puts forward something called the Enabling Act. This law would basically give him the power to make laws all by himself, no parliament needed, for 4 years. On the day of the vote, picture this. The building is literally surrounded by his armed stormtroopers. And yet, in the face of all that, the leader of the Social Democrats, Otto Wels, gets up and gives this unbelievably brave speech against it. It was really the last gasp of German democracy.
But it wasn't enough. The final vote came in, 444 to 94. The Enabling Act passed. Through a mix of intimidation and political maneuvering, the German parliament essentially voted to make itself obsolete. In a way, it was a legally sanctioned suicide of a democracy. So now he has what amounts to legal dictatorial power. And he immediately starts a process with a very German, very bureaucratic, and frankly, very chilling name,
Gleichschaltung.
Gleichschaltung. It basically means coordination or synchronization. And what it really meant was a systematic, step-by-step takeover of every single aspect of German life that wasn't already Nazi. All other political parties? Banned. Trade unions? Abolished and replaced. State governments? Gone. Replaced by Nazi governors. Media, culture, even professional groups like doctors and lawyers, all of it was coordinated, brought under Nazi control. In just a few months, Germany was a one-party state. Period.
So by 1934, pretty much all outside opposition is crushed. But now, Hitler's facing a huge new threat, and this one is coming from inside his own movement. And his solution was just pure, shocking brutality.
So here's the problem he had. You have the SA, his paramilitary brown shirts, who had grown to this massive force of over 2 million guys. Their leader, Ernst Röhm, had this big idea. He wanted to absorb the professional German army, the Wehrmacht, and create a new people's army. Now, the army generals, they were absolutely horrified by this. So Hitler had a choice to make. Does he back his old friend Röhm, or does he back the powerful German military?
He chose the army. Over one weekend, in what became known as the Night of the Long Knives, Hitler's SS hunted down and murdered Röhm and the entire SA leadership. But they didn't stop there. They used it as an excuse to settle all kinds of old scores, killing other political rivals, even a former chancellor. The message couldn't have been clearer. Total loyalty was the only thing that mattered. Anything less, and you were dead.
So, with every rival, inside his party and out, now either silenced or dead, and with the army owing him a huge favor, the very last piece of the puzzle was about to fall into place.
President Hindenburg, the old man who was the last remaining official check on Hitler's power. He dies. And within hours, Hitler makes an announcement. The job of president and the job of chancellor are now one and the same. They're merged into a new title, Führer. And just like that, he was head of state, head of government, and commander of the military. The whole shebang.
And this led to the final and maybe the most profound change of all. The entire German military was immediately ordered to swear a new oath of loyalty. And the difference between the old oath and the new one tells you everything you need to know. Before, they swore loyalty to the Constitution and to the country. Now, they swore unconditional personal loyalty, not to Germany, but directly to Adolf Hitler. The state was no longer a set of laws or an idea. The state was now just one man.
And there you have it. In just 18 months, every single check and balance, every freedom, every institution designed to prevent this was gone. It all leaves you with a really sobering question, doesn't it? It just forces you to wonder, exactly how fragile are the institutions, the laws, and just the unwritten rules that we all count on to protect our own democracy?
All right, we're diving into something really complex today, a true paradox from one of history's darkest chapters. How on earth could the Nazi regime, a system responsible for just unimaginable brutality, also be genuinely popular with so many of its own people? It's this disturbing mix, isn't it? Prosperity on one hand and persecution on the other, happening at the exact same time. And that leads us to the big question we're going to explore.
Yeah, how can a system of terror also be genuinely popular? It's the core of the whole thing. It's so easy to just assume that everyone in Germany was living in this constant state of fear, right? But the reality, well, it was way, way more complicated than that. A lot of Germans actually truly supported the regime. And to even begin to understand why, we have to look at what life was actually like for them, day in and day out.
Okay, so just look at these numbers. When Hitler grabbed power in 1933, Germany was an economic disaster zone. A staggering 6 million people were unemployed. That's just a mind-boggling number. But then, fast forward just 5 years to 1938, and unemployment is basically gone. It's near zero. You have to imagine, for millions of people who'd just been through the absolute misery of the Great Depression, this didn't just feel good, it felt like a straight-up economic miracle. So the big question is, how did they pull it off? This economic miracle, as they called it, really became the foundation of Hitler's popularity. It was something people could see and feel every day. It gave a nation that felt totally hopeless a new sense of pride and purpose. Well, a huge piece of the puzzle was massive government spending on public works projects. You've probably heard of the most famous one, the Autobahn highway system. And these weren't just roads, they were these huge, visible symbols of a new, modern, powerful Germany. And maybe most importantly, they put hundreds of thousands of men back to work, earning a paycheck. And the other engine driving this whole recovery? Rearmament.
The Nazis just thumbed their noses at the Treaty of Versailles and started pouring insane amounts of money into rebuilding the military. This absolutely supercharged German industry. Factories that had been dead quiet for years were suddenly roaring back to life, and that, of course, meant even more jobs. But here's where that shiny miracle starts to look, well, a lot darker. Because those incredible job numbers, they were kind of a lie, a statistical trick. See, young men were basically forced into labor service. Women were pressured pretty heavily to leave their jobs and go back home. So, poof, they're off the unemployment lists. And then the most sinister part. Jewish people were systematically fired from their jobs, which were then given to so-called Aryan Germans. All of these groups were just erased from the official stats. These weren't just economic policies, they were acts of persecution dressed up as good news. And this gets to a really, really crucial point. For the people the Nazis called the racial community, the Germans who weren't Jewish or Roma or disabled or political enemies, life in the 1930s actually felt pretty good. It felt prosperous, it felt purposeful. The terror was real, for sure, but it was aimed at other people. For that majority, these years felt stable and full of this restored national pride. So now let's flip that coin over and look at the other side. Because while all this economic recovery was happening, something else was being built right alongside it. A brutal, systematic racial state. The prosperity for some was paid for directly by the persecution of others. And you have to understand, this persecution wasn't chaotic or random. Not at all. It was a methodical, step-by-step escalation. It started almost the second they took power in 1933, opening concentration camps for their political opponents. Then by 1935, it gets written into law. And just a few years later, in 1938, it explodes into this terrifying, nationwide violence out in the open. These Nuremberg laws were the legal bedrock for the whole racial state. On one hand, you had the Reich citizenship law. This basically said, if you're Jewish, you're not a citizen anymore. You're a subject of the state. And with that, they stripped away all political rights. At the same time, you had the law for the protection of German blood. This made it illegal for Jews and non-Jewish Germans to marry or even have relationships. Suddenly, the government was controlling the most personal, intimate parts of people's lives to enforce its racial ideology. And the impact of this in the real world was just devastating. This wasn't some abstract legal debate. We're talking about Jewish doctors who were suddenly forbidden from treating non-Jewish patients, Jewish lawyers disbarred, Jewish teachers fired from their jobs, Jewish businesses were boycotted, their owners ruined, and Jewish children. They were expelled from their schools, kicked out of their own classrooms. An entire community was being methodically and deliberately erased from public life. This whole horrifying process really came to a head with the violence of Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. It was a state-organized rampage. And in just 2 nights, think about this, 7,500 Jewish-owned businesses were completely destroyed. And it wasn't just about smashing windows and burning buildings. 30,000 Jewish men were arrested, rounded up, and shipped off to concentration camps. This was a terrifying signal to everyone. The phase of just legal and social exclusion was over. A new era of mass state-sponsored violence had just begun. So, you might be wondering, how did the regime actually enforce all of this on a population of 80 million people? Well, it took a very sophisticated and very terrifying system of control, a true police state. And right at the heart of that system was the SS, the Schutzstaffel. Now, this thing started out as just Hitler's personal bodyguard, but under Heinrich Himmler, it grew into this enormous, sprawling organization. The SS was like a state within the state. It had its hands in everything, controlling the police, the concentration camps, all of it. But here's a fact that might actually shock you. The Gestapo, the dreaded secret police everyone was terrified of, they only had about 32,000 officials. That's it. So you have to ask yourself, how in the world could such a small group police an entire country? Especially a country of 80 million people. I mean, the math just doesn't add up. It seems impossible. Until, that is, you uncover the terrifying secret to their power. See, the Gestapo didn't need to be everywhere at once, because ordinary German citizens did most of the spying for them. The whole system ran on denunciations, people telling on their neighbors for making a joke about Hitler, reporting their coworkers for listening to a foreign radio station, even turning in their own family members. The police state wasn't just imposed from the top down, it worked because of widespread, popular complicity from the bottom up. But raw power and fear weren't enough.
For the Nazis, the ultimate goal was to completely reshape how every single German thought and felt. It was about creating a totally indoctrinated mind, from cradle to grave. And the architect of this was Joseph Goebbels. He built this massive propaganda machine that took over everything, every newspaper, every radio station, every movie studio. They even mass-produced these cheap little radios called the People's Radio, specifically to make sure the Nazi message was pumped directly into every single home. At the same time, famous films glorified the regime, while modern art, anything that challenged their worldview, was condemned as degenerate and banned. And that indoctrination began right there in the classroom. The entire school curriculum was just rewritten. History wasn't about learning what happened anymore. It was a grand story of racial struggle. Biology class became a lesson in so-called racial hygiene. And above all, kids were taught that their most sacred duty, more important than family or religion, was their absolute loyalty to Adolf Hitler. And this was all formalized in this really structured pipeline of youth groups. Starting when you were just 10 years old, you were funneled into these organizations. For boys, it was the Hitler Youth, which eventually became mandatory. For girls, it was the League of German Girls. And these groups were clever. They mixed fun stuff like camping and sports with just relentless ideological brainwashing, effectively molding an entire generation to their will. And all of this brings us right back to where we started. That economic recovery that so many people loved, and the brutal terror that destroyed so many lives. They weren't separate things. They weren't opposites. They were two sides of the very same coin. The whole project of creating a prosperous racial community was, by its very nature, a project that required excluding, robbing, and ultimately destroying everyone who didn't fit in. So this history leaves us with a really tough, uncomfortable question. And it's one that goes way beyond Germany in the 1930s. What are we as people willing to ignore or look past in the name of our own comfort, stability, or economic security? What is the true final cost of any kind of prosperity that's built on excluding and dehumanizing others?